The most complex and most liberating part of this process is when a woman understands that her emotional growth is not an attack on the other, but a reconciliation with herself. Freud spoke of the return of the repressed. Everything that has been suppressed throughout life eventually returns, seeking elaboration. And that's exactly what happens to the woman who breaks with the role of automatic emotional caregiver. She begins to remember her desires, her limits, her dreams that were buried under the obligation to keep the other whole. This return can be unsettling, yes. Sometimes she feels lost, selfish, even guilty, because her identity was built on the idea that love means sacrifice. But over time, she discovers a brutal and liberating truth. It is not possible to truly love someone without loving herself first. This understanding causes a rupture not only internally, but also socially. Because the woman who chooses to grow, to say no, to set boundaries, often becomes the target of judgment. She is called cold, ungrateful, difficult, too feminist. These labels are the system's way of trying to put her back in the place socially designated to her. Freud said that symptoms are the expression of an unresolved psychic conflict, and many men, and even other women, project their own unresolved conflicts onto the figure of the woman who dares to be free. She becomes an uncomfortable mirror. With each choice she makes for herself, she reminds others that they too could have chosen differently, and that, for many, is unbearable. But the most impressive thing is that this woman, when she frees herself, does not become less loving. On the contrary, she learns to love in a more whole, more conscious, more just way. Freud called this stage the integration of the ego, when the subject stops being driven only by unconscious desires and begins to live in harmony with their inner truth. The integrated woman no longer accepts relationships where she must shrink to fit. She no longer wants to emotionally educate partners, to emotionally sustain childish adults, to be saved by empty promises. She wants reciprocity, and reciprocity requires maturity. It requires men who are not afraid of female autonomy, but who admire it, who are not threatened by her strength, but inspired by it. And this new man is also emerging, slowly, yes, but he is. Men who go to therapy, who explore their shadows, who have learned to listen without becoming defensive, who know that partnership is not dependency, it is choice. Freud taught us that love is only true when two individualities meet without merging, without nullifying each other. And this is the new paradigm that is being born, still with pain, still with resistance, but inevitably. Because there is no turning back for the awakened woman. She no longer fits into silence, into shadow, into waiting. And each step she takes toward herself, even if alone, is a revolution that echoes in other women. And, one day, also in men. In the end, female growth does not destroy the man. It only demands that he grows too. And this is the greatest gift a woman can offer a man. The invitation to maturity. No longer as a mother, caregiver, or therapist, but as an equal, as a whole presence, as someone who does not need, but who chooses to be there. And only those who are whole can truly love. This is the silent revolution that Freud, perhaps without foreseeing, helped us to understand. The liberation of the woman is not the end of love. It is the beginning of a new way of loving. Freer, more honest, more human. As Freud explored, the emotionally immature man is not simply a product of individual choices, but the result of a culture that failed to demand that he grow up emotionally. From early childhood, boys are often taught that expressing vulnerability is a sign of weakness, that dominance is a virtue, and that their needs must be met first. This cultural conditioning does not prepare them to engage in relationships where emotional reciprocity is required. So, when they face a woman who knows what she wants, who sets boundaries, who says no without guilt, the fragile man doesn't see an equal. He sees a threat. And what does Freud say about threats? That they awaken our most primitive defenses. In this case, the man defends himself by attacking, by diminishing the woman, by labeling her as difficult, cold, or exaggerated. The mature woman, who has passed through the fire of self-knowledge, no longer tolerates the roles once imposed upon her. She is no longer willing to be the emotional babysitter, the translator of silences, or the nurse of wounded egos. She has learned to prioritize her mental health, her dreams, and above all, her emotional truth. This makes her dangerous to the fragile man, because her independence unmasks his dependence. Her clarity exposes his confusion. Her strength amplifies his insecurities. Freud would call this an identity collapse. The man no longer knows who he is when his worth is no longer measured by the control he has over the woman beside him. This confrontation leads to a power conflict. The emotionally immature man begins to sabotage the relationship not because he does not love the woman, but because he does not know how to coexist with her freedom. And that is where Freud's theories about the unconscious return with full force. The man may say he admires strong women, but unconsciously he fears them. Because a strong woman is not manipulable. She won't tolerate emotional blackmail. She doesn't soften her voice so he won't feel hurt. She doesn't accept being half-loved. And that, for someone who was conditioned to be served, not to serve, is unbearable. This is why many women today feel more alone in relationships than when they were single. Because they are in relationships where they cannot be themselves, where they must shrink to fit into someone else's expectations. And Freud would say this generates a neurosis, a conflict between the real self and the imposed self. The woman wants to be whole, but to be loved, she has to fragment herself. And living fragmented day after day erodes identity, confidence, desire. The body feels it. The soul screams. But society still tells her, be patient. He will change. Support him. No, Freud would say. The time has come to deconstruct this emotional servitude masked as love. The more a woman evolves, the more she reclaims her voice, her space, and her right to say no, the more a particular type of man begins to tremble. Not all men. Freud would urge us to avoid generalizations that bypass the nuances of the unconscious. But a significant portion of emotionally immature men feel, deep in their psyche, a dangerous discomfort with a woman who no longer needs to be saved, pleased, or guided. And what Freud helps us understand is that this discomfort does not arise from logic, but from unresolved internal conflicts, often rooted in the earliest childhood dynamics between the boy and his mother. The man who was not emotionally weaned becomes an adult who seeks not a partner, but a surrogate figure. Someone who listens without confronting, gives without asking, and stays without questioning. When a woman begins to grow, to demand reciprocity, to assert her independence, it is not only a change in dynamics, it is, for this man, a narcissistic wound. Freud would describe this as a threat to the male ego, which was built on illusions of superiority and control. A strong woman dismantles those illusions simply by existing, simply by refusing to shrink herself. And so begins the subtle war of the emotionally fragile passive-aggressive remarks, emotional withdrawal, the infamous "you're too much" or "you've changed." But what has changed, in truth, is not the woman. It is the power dynamic. And for the immature man, power is mistaken for love. Without it, he feels lost, irrelevant, emasculated. Freud would explain this reaction as a regression to the earliest stages of development, where the male child experiences a symbolic castration, the realization that he is not the center of the universe, that the mother has her own desires, her own autonomy. When the woman he is with today reclaims her autonomy, she triggers this old trauma. But instead of facing it, he blames her. He says she's become cold, distant, arrogant. He does not realize that what he is mourning is not her affection, but her submission. And in this mourning, he may sabotage the relationship, preferring the comfort of dominance over the discomfort of equality. The woman, on the other hand, often feels guilt in this process. Freud called this the superego's voice, the internalized judgment that says, "You're being selfish, you're abandoning him." But this voice is not hers. It is the echo of generations of conditioning, where the good woman is the one who stays, who saves, who sacrifices. Yet Freud also spoke of the process of sublimation, transforming inner conflict into personal evolution. And it is precisely here that the modern woman finds her power, not in fighting him, but in choosing herself, in understanding that she is not responsible for the emotional immaturity of the other, that her growth is not an attack but an act of survival. And this growth is not linear. There are setbacks. There are nights of doubt, moments of loneliness, the temptation to go back to being the emotional caregiver. But each time she says no, each time she reclaims a boundary, she is breaking a centuries-old chain. Freud would see this as a liberation of the repressed self, a process in which the woman stops being an object of projection and becomes a subject in her own right. She no longer wants to be idealized or rescued. She wants to be seen, to be met, to be respected. And that, for the immature man, is terrifying, because it demands that he grows too, that he confronts his own fears, his own wounds, his own shadows. Some will refuse, some will flee, some will try to break her, so she returns to the place of silence. But others, those who are ready, will rise. They will look at this woman and not see a threat, but a mirror that shows not their weakness, but their potential. And then, and only then, can real intimacy begin. According to Freud, every human defense mechanism hides an ancient fear. And for many emotionally immature men, the fear is not of being abandoned by a woman, but of facing a woman who no longer seeks to be completed by him. This is where the male identity, conditioned by centuries of patriarchy, finds itself threatened. Because in Freud's vision, the ego does not exist in a vacuum. It is built in relation to the other. And when this other, the woman, ceases to revolve around his needs, his symbolic world collapses. The woman who stops serving emotionally becomes dangerous, not because she attacks, but because she stops offering herself as emotional fuel for the man's fragile ego. This collapse is not just psychological, it is also symbolic. The woman who reclaims her time, her body, and her silence stops being the projection of the man's desires and becomes a mirror that shows him what he never learned to develop: self-sufficiency, emotional regulation, active listening. Freud would say that the man, still trapped in a narcissistic stage of development, feels castrated when the woman no longer affirms him. And castration, in psychoanalysis, is not about the literal organ. It is the symbolic loss of power, of control, of centrality. That is why immature men often react with aggression, irony, or disdain when they meet a free woman, because, unconsciously, she awakens the boy they still are inside. This internal boy seeks a mother figure who soothes, forgives, and never confronts. Freud called this fixation the Oedipus complex, where the unresolved desire to be the mother's only center results in adult men who cannot stand female autonomy. For them, the independent woman is not just a challenge, she is a rupture. She breaks the illusion that love is submission, that affection is silence, that emotional labor is the woman's role. And this is why many men abandon these women, not because they are unlovable, but because they are too whole to be tamed. Freud would say that the man who flees a conscious woman is fleeing his own psychological evolution. But when a woman understands this, something profound changes. She stops taking rejection personally. She understands that the male immaturity that abandons, ignores, or tries to dominate is not her fault. It is a symptom of a system that has not taught men how to deal with strong, present, lucid women. And then she stops shrinking to be loved. She stops self-sabotaging to keep peace. She stops faking fragility to maintain relationships. She becomes the woman Freud hinted at in his question. What does a woman want? A woman who no longer wants to be an answer, but a question. And in being that question, she becomes a force of transformation. Because every woman who refuses to be a mirror and chooses to be a voice instead causes a tremor in the unconscious of a generation. She brings back the possibility that love can be a meeting of equals, not an emotional contract of servitude. She re-educates, not by teaching, but by existing. And this existence, brave, visible, conscious, is, as Freud would say, the true act of sublimation, transforming suffering into creation, silence into discourse, repetition into awakening. So, when a woman stops apologizing for existing, when she decides to no longer sacrifice herself on the altar of emotional validation, she is not becoming cold. She is warming up the world to a new way of loving, a love that does not imprison, a love that does not drain, a love that does not demand masks, a love that allows both to be, fully, without fear. And in this freedom, the emotionally mature man is also born, not as someone who dominates, but as someone who accompanies. Because, in the end, Freud was right. Everything that is repressed returns, and the return of the free woman is the return of truth in relationships.